Hey folks, Randy Newberg here, and we are in my lovely home valley in Montana, the Gallatin Valley, Bozeman, Montana. Gosh, I feel lucky to live here, especially when it's this beautiful. My guest today is a guy, and he's a Montana State University alum, and that's not why he's here. It helps. He doesn't live in Bozeman. He lives in Loveland, Colorado. But he is more informed about a topic that I want to get to, and we're going to get to that today. He's more informed about it than anyone I know. He's got all these degrees. He's got a master's from University of Wyoming, undergrad from Montana State University, PhD in forest ecology from Oregon State. Ed Arnett, comma PhD, right, Ed?
Pilot higher and deeper. Post-hole digger.
Post-hole digger. Yeah. Well, Ed Arnett is the senior scientist for the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. And I've been a big game hunter all my life. And welcome, Ed. I appreciate you taking time to be here.
No, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. And I'm going to right away in this podcast try to connect you listeners to the topic of sage grouse and sage grouse habitats, the way that I've become connected to it. Because the question everyone asks right away is, I'm a big game hunter. Why in the hell do I care about sage grouse? I've only shot 2 sage grouse in my life, and it was kind of by accident. And so it would be easy for me to discount, you know what, they're just this big dumb bird. Why do I care? And so, Ed, your job in this podcast is, and I know you're going to do a great job because you're passionate about this and you know this information better than anybody. Tell me in a minute why the listener who's a big game hunter or a fisherman or whatever should care about the plight of sage grouse in the United States.
Well, I think there are 2 key points that I try to make to not just the sportsman's community, but also the general public. The fact that a once abundant, fairly widely distributed, and fairly liberally harvested game bird is now at population levels low enough to be even considered under the, to be listed under the Endangered Species Act should be a concern. It should be a concern
as a
general principle, should be a concern to everyone. Not just sportsmen, but it should be to sportsmen whether they hunt sage grouse or not. But it should be a concern to all stakeholders and the general public as well. But this is more than just about sage grouse. This is about an ecosystem, Sagebrush Ecosystems, and that ecosystem is the home for 350 plus species of plants and animals, and a lot of those are pursued by sportsmen, pronghorn, mule deer, elk, and any number of other non-game and other game species as well. So it's about a system. And the sage grouse is what we call an umbrella species, basically. And it's wide-ranging, covers large landscapes. And the idea they're an obligate of sagebrush habitats. Others are what we call associates, so they associate themselves in some way, shape, or form with sagebrush. But sage grouse are dependent on that system. So they're really kind of a modern-day canary in the coal mine. And that canary is really telling us that those sagebrush ecosystems are in decline, both in quantity and quality of the habitat. And so that's why we need to pay attention, because this is a system that provides so much habitat for so many of the types of animals that sportsmen really do care about and pursue.
Okay. You've sold me. And the reason that you've sold me is I look at the map. You guys have published a lot of great stuff. And I look at the map of what is the historic range of sage grouse in North America. And it's large. It extends from the Great Plains to the Sierra Mountains. It extends from southern Canada to northern Arizona.
It's amazing we've lost huge. Half of it.
And I look at how much hunting I do on those landscapes. Anyone who watches my TV show, listens to this podcast, knows that Randy Newberg would trade his elk tag for a pronghorn tag every year. And you're looking at me like, I'm not sure if that look is, you're an idiot, Randy, or I can relate to that.
I can relate to that.
So,
I love pronghorn myself.
I look at sage grouse, and you talk about they've reached numbers of some. They've went from obviously some number down to some other number. What are those? What's that trend? Where has it went?
It was guesstimated, I'll say, because it's hard to estimate from those old records. But, like bison, like many of the large ungulates in any species, people will throw large numbers out there, 60 million bison. It was guesstimated that there was somewhere around 16 million sage grouse at one point in time. They covered 13 states and at least 2 provinces that I recall. But they've lost about half of that range. It's very difficult to count sage grouse, largely because it's dependent on counting males at leks. We don't always know how many leks there are. We don't always see all the males, but the estimate right now is somewhere in the 200,000 to 500,000 range of birds, based on a lot of assumptions. In today's
at this count,
right. Now, obviously, we're never going to get back to historic levels with bison or any other most other species, but there's certainly been declining for a number of years. There's some recent trends that indicate that we've been losing roughly 1% of at least the male sector of the population per year for quite some time. So it's been a slow, steady decline. The one thing people need to understand is that these are game birds, and all game bird populations fluctuate, and sometimes very radically. And particularly with climatic conditions, precipitation is, of course, a major factor. And we've been on an upswing lately because we're pulling out of the drought, at least in some parts of their range. At least temporarily for the last couple of years, we've had good precipitation, but in other parts of the range of the species, we haven't had good rain, and the numbers have continued to decline. In Montana alone last year, I believe it was a 45% decline of males attending leks. Ooh. Now this year it's up 20-some. I don't have the exact figures, but it's up this year.
Wow. I mean, I think about that because I hunt. Montana's my home state. So I go out to eastern Montana around the Missouri River breaks, down in the Powder River country, the Tongue River country, and I do see sage grouse. I don't shoot them. But I want to get back to something you said there, leks. Some of the listeners are probably going to say, what's a lek? And that gets to why this is important, because leks, the entire landscape of the Great Basin of the Intermountain West, even though to the non-hunter, it all looks the same. We who hunt know that it's not all the same. That even if it looks this way, it gets used differently by wildlife for certain attributes, certain values. A lek is where the breeding happens.
Correct.
In the sage grouse community.
Correct. A nice little human metaphor with a local bar here that you may be familiar with is the cat's paw. Lots of men stroll down to the cat's paw hoping to impress females. At least that was the case when I was here and going to school in the 80s. So this is a place where males congregate. They have a very elaborate dance. They try to show off to the females, express their dominance, and that's an evolutionary development of a breeding strategy to express dominance, and the females try to select the most dominant males, passing on the best genes.
We have a guy out on our website. He goes by MT Miller, Montana Miller, who every spring he's out on these leks, and he posts some of the most incredible pictures of these sage grouse and even sharp-tailed grouse out there fighting. I mean, these sage grouse, they throw down.
They do. I watched a little of that this spring myself.
Yeah, and it's incredible to see a native species so dependent upon this ritual of mating. And because we think about the elk rut as kind of this ritual thing, or we think about the white-tailed rut in early November of kind of a crazy period when animals do stuff that we just look at and say, wow, no, that's cool.
Yeah.
The springtime mating of sage grouse on their leks, their behaviors, I wish everybody would get a chance to hear it because it's noisy and to see it.
It's a fascinating display. It really is interesting to watch.
So when we go to these leks, when you talk about these counts on leks, tell me how important these leks are. Are they more important, less important than the greater sage community that surrounds them? Or?
No, it's in combination. The lek site itself, and these leks move and expand, so they're pretty plastic and flexible. A lot of the less dominant males may establish new portions of a new lek somewhere else, trying to establish a connection with the females when they've been booted off the main leks. But those are centralized locations where the birds come to display, and they're very loyal, high fidelity. And that's a really critical, important point here is those leks. And again, it can't just necessarily be one point on the map, but some space around that, you're going to find those birds year after year after year. But the landscape around them is critically important, because some studies have shown that up to 95% of the females will nest within about a 4-mile radius. And that varies of the lek. And that varies from 80 to 90, but a very high proportion of the females that come into those leks and get bred go out and nest somewhere within that landscape. So when we look at the conservation, it's not just about protecting the actual lek site, it's about protecting that landscape around that lek for nesting and brood rearing, which is really the most important period. It's important that the females get bred and they do the mating rituals, of course, but the most important thing for populations and putting more birds on the landscape is nest productivity and nest survival and brood survival.
Very much like when I talk to a waterfowl biologist. He says, wetlands are great, but if you only have a narrow band of grassland around that wetland, every coyote, every fox, every skunk, every raccoon knows, well, I've got a 10-yard band of nesting cover here. Nest. Yeah. And people will say, well, we had water in the wetland. Why didn't we have great nesting results this year? So these leks are the place where you scientists, you big brain types, can go and get consistent year after year trend data.
Correct. To go and count the birds. Now, again, the population estimates are just a little bit more tricky. Yeah. And it's a male-based assessment, and there's a lot of assumptions. You're not going to see all the animals. So there's some studies that suggest that you may see half of the males, and you may not see all the leks. So there's a detection issue, but also it's hard to count females, almost virtually impossible. So what we do is use assumptions, and some studies have demonstrated that there's maybe a 2-to-1 ratio, a 1.7 male to female ratio. So then you can use some math and estimate that there may be X number of birds in the population driven from that male count. But it's imperfect. There's a lot of controversy around it, but it's the best we have at this point. So what you're really looking for are trends in those lek counts over time.
Okay. So I love hunting mule deer. If you gave me one species to hunt with a bow, or maybe I should restate this. If you're going to let me hunt mule deer, I want to do it with a bow. And mule deer are so dependent upon these same communities, these same plant biological communities. You said earlier that the sage grouse is the canary in the coal mine. Tell me how this same worry that we should have for sage grouse, or maybe how what is happening for sage grouse, becomes the story or the insight or the crack in the door, the crystal ball, whatever you want to call it, for my cherished mule deer.
Well, if you look at mule deer populations, and you already know this, I'm sure you do, mule deer have been in decline for quite a number of years.
Right.
So there's an interesting correlation there, whether it's directly tied to what's going on with sagebrush and sage grouse habitats. It's coincidental to some extent, but there's quantitative evidence to suggest that habitat loss, declining quality, changes in vegetative communities, and any number of things, but it really comes down to that loss of both quantity and quality of habitat. Coincidentally, mule deer are down across the West as well. And there's a lot of complicating factors here. Right. West Nile virus for sage grouse has been a complicating factor. Fire, invasive species. It's not all about development and true habitat loss. Habitat loss can occur in different ways.
Right.
And a lot of things have factored into mule deer too, but they no doubt have been in decline, and we've been watching this pretty closely.
Right. Anyone who likes to hunt mule deer knows it's getting harder and harder to draw a tag.
Yep.
And I did not go to college here. I'm not a mighty bobcat of Montana State University. I'm the alum of the Wolf Pack of Nevada, Reno. Even though I grew up in northern Minnesota, I graduated from college in Reno, lived in Nevada for 5 years. And a couple of things you just said have struck me in my travels back to Nevada. So I graduated from college in Nevada in 1989. And now I go back there and hunt every time they'll give me a tag and a permit. And the reason that I use Nevada as an example, because when I look at your maps of primary conservation areas, core habitat, Nevada is a big part of that.
Yes, it is.
And especially eastern and northeastern Nevada. So I look at things like, you mentioned fire and you mentioned invasive species. For me, when I'm an elk hunter and I'm thinking about mountain habitats and alpine habitats, fire is this great thing. When I go elk hunting, I'm almost on a first name basis with a lot of the fire managers in the West because I want to know where the fires were, what time of the summer they occurred, what intensity they burnt at. And I'm either going to hunt them that year or the next year.
When the vegetation establishes, yeah.
Right. So tell me how fire, whether beneficial or detrimental, short-term or long-term, impacts these sage communities, because I have my own theory about fire and sage and mule deer, and I'm not a biologist, but it's just from a hunter's perspective. So I want to hear how fire and sage communities, what that interaction is to the benefit or detriment of sage grouse.
One way to think about sagebrush is it's a miniature old growth forest, if you will. These are communities that establish over long, long periods of time.
Like
and
50 years, hundreds of years.
Decades, yes.
Okay.
Yes, definitely 50 to well over 100 years. And I'll get to this in a minute, but I just read some new research on how long it takes to recover. But there's a good body of evidence out there that shows that after fire, and it depends on the precipitation zone, the site conditions, the soil conditions, topography aspect. Lots of things go into how vegetation reestablishes after fire. But particularly in dry sites, Wyoming big sage dominated communities, it can take multiple decades. And the paper I was reading recently suggests 80 years. And this isn't post-fire. This is actually post-rehabilitation of oil and gas development, where basically sagebrush was removed from the landscape. But the fire studies show the same thing, is that it takes, long periods of time and literally 80 to 100 years sometimes for these sites to come back into productive, established communities. The problem with invasive species like cheatgrass, which is a very flashy fuel,
right.
Once it establishes,
I hate cheatgrass.
We all hate cheatgrass.
When someone says cheatgrass, my blood pressure goes up. And for those listening who don't understand what cheatgrass is, it's an invasive grass species.
Invasive annual grass, very aggressive.
Very aggressive, outcompetes most everything, and very endemic in the Great Basin area, southern Idaho, Nevada, southwest or southeast Oregon, and moving. Unfortunately, I see it in Utah.
We have it here too.
And it as quick as a fire comes through, it's the first thing to come up.
Yep.
And it has very little value from a plant community standpoint as it relates to any of the species we're talking about, whether it's mule deer, pronghorn, sage grouse.
Right.
So they just
very minimal food value when it first sprouts in the spring, and beyond that, it's not utilized. It's an annual.
Does it have any livestock value? Can they?
Early on. when the green shoots are coming up. I mean, I've seen bighorn sheep eat it, in burns, but it's very narrow window of time, when the green shoots are coming up. But to the point, it becomes dry very quickly, and now you've got a really combustible fire situation. And the point here, I think, is that fire cycle, which is very long term in some of these sage systems, it's exacerbated with that flashy fuel, and it can just keep the fires going more frequently, and more intensively actually, and spread further. And there's all kinds of complications with cheatgrass. The birds don't use it. Most animals don't use it. It replaces native forbs. Bunch grass communities would provide the proper nesting cover. All of these kinds of things. It's a whole suite of issues with the invasives. That all are not in favor for sage grouse or other native species.
So when I lived in Nevada, we all loved to hunt up around Elko, Carlin, Battle Mountain, Winnemucca, and the quality of the winter range, when I was there, I had no idea I was living in Nevada in the glory days. When you're living in the good times, you don't realize it. Now I drive through there, and what used to be huge expanses of winter ground, which in the Northern Rockies, people think of winter ground as grasses for elk. For mule deer, these were sage communities. Now, there's not a sagebrush for miles in many places. It's nothing but this yellow, silverish cheatgrass.
From burns?
From burns.
Yeah.
And it's damn hard to draw a tag in Nevada in some of those places now. And that's not, just purely from a hunter opportunity standpoint, that's not good.
Right.
From a health of the landscape, when you have invasive species having that great of impact, obviously that's not good. And for the poor sage grouse, who's kind of looked at as this ugly, the West version of a dodo bird, that's terrible. I mean, I assume that for sage grouse, it's a function of habitat for food, habitat for security, habitat for nesting, habitat for every life need.
All the above. And they're very dependent on it for food in the wintertime.
As our
as our mule deer.
And as our pronghorn.
Yeah. And again, when you remove those, and here's the thing, is you're getting these large fires. These are not little spot fires that burn 100 acres here and there, which can be very good for sage grouse. They do they don't have to have 100% sagebrush all and 100% cover all the time. They need those, open spaces with grasses and forbs, but and obviously big game like that. But these fires are expansive, and they're taking out hundreds of thousands of acres at a time in the big, larger fires. And it takes, if it takes 60 to 80 years for that to come back, well, that's, you get the picture.
Oh, for sure.
Long-term impact on those landscapes.
So, again, back to the sage grouse being the canary. Tell me how that canary is expressing concerns every big game hunter should have.
Well, again, it's through their population declines, but it translates to that broader landscape. This is a bird that utilizes large landscapes. They don't like disturbance. They can only handle certain amounts of disturbance before you start seeing those declines, at least based on the lek counts and some of the nest success studies and brood success studies that have been done. To me, it translates directly to pronghorn and mule deer because they are sensitive to disturbance as well. You can only put so many oil wells or wind farms or housing developments or other structures in the landscape before you start seeing an effect. And I always when I was working in the timber industry and on forest management issues, early successional stage forests are critically important to a wide suite of species.
Right.
And you put 100-acre clear cut out in a 70,000-acre landscape, it's not going to have any influence at all on older forest species or those that use closed canopy forest situations. But you keep adding them up. And at some point, there's a threshold and a tipping point where now you've favored early successional species, but those that utilize those older conditions are going to start feeling the burden.
The change.
It's the same thing with landscape perturbations of oil and gas development, roads, all of these kinds of things.
Right.
And there's a tipping point at some point, and people have this tendency to think that the animals just will go somewhere else because they got 4 legs or wings.
Right.
And that's not how it works. That's just not how it works.
Right.
They've established these patterns. There's a reason that animals migrate through the same corridor year after year after year after year. There's this reason why they go to the same lek year after year after year.
Right.
And there can be some flexibility there, but my point, of course, is that there is a tipping point in the landscape and thresholds, and we don't understand that very well for a lot of species. But back to how the sage grouse has told us some things, I think that disturbance, by minimizing those disturbances, you've now minimized disturbance for mule deer, pronghorn, wintering elk, any number of species, and that's good. It's going to benefit them.
So, and this is where, we're going to get into some politics here, because a lot of this is on public lands.
Yep.
And some people are going to fly off the handle and say, Randy, you're some sort of communist, blah, 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 whatever. That would imply that I care, that they think I'm too against what they think I should be for. But like I told you, I love hunting pronghorn. And I don't want to come across as a hypocrite who drives a truck to Wyoming to hunt pronghorn, or to eastern Montana to hunt pronghorn. I heat my house with natural gas. I have all kinds of petroleum products that make my life better. So I'm not discounting the value and the need and the demand for oil and gas products. Me directly, we as a society and a community, we need that. But I have friends who are in the oil and gas industry. And I ask them, I'm like, when I go and hunt the Red Desert in Wyoming, or I go and hunt the areas around LaBarge or Big Piney or south of Green River, I look at this stuff, and you guys tell me you're doing all this, you have all this technology to do everything supposedly wildlife friendly, by disturbing the landscape much less, multi-directional drilling, and all the other things that they tell me they can do. And so I ask them, is that what this is? Every square mile has 8 pads on it. That doesn't look like wildlife friendly to me. Not just the pad itself, but the roads to get there. Every road I see in these critical sage communities where the soil gets disturbed, the roads are nothing. You can identify them so easily. I mean, even if they weren't a road, because of all the invasive plant species where there's any soil disturbances. So I'm trying to figure out, we as hunters, how can we advocate for a balance of, here's what we need. We know we need this. We're not fools, we all know it. But how can we be the voice for the sage grouse, for the pronghorn, for the mule deer, for the songbird, for the whatever it is, the cotton-tailed rabbit, the jackrabbit, so that we can do this responsibly and not look back 20 years, 30 years, 50 years from now and say, boy, did we screw that up.
Well, I think you hit it right on the head with the words balance and responsible. And I think that it's easy to point out problems. I mean, we can drive across the landscape and find problems really easily. And scientists and anyone really, any member of the public, it's easy to point out a problem. It's harder to develop a solution. But really, to me, the solution does focus on that balance and getting better balance for fish and wildlife, better balance for what sportsmen bring to the table, and that's part of the outdoor recreation-based economy. Our outdoor economy, which is driven in part by hunting and fishing, is a huge driver, and it's not well recognized, in my opinion. Right. I mean, we tout it and we talk about it a lot, but it certainly isn't as recognized. It still seems to pale in comparison to the other industrialized economies, and yet it overshadows them numbers-wise in many cases. And for whatever reason, it doesn't always resonate. So I think we need to continue to really pound on that our recreational opportunities, our contributions to the outdoor recreation-based economy are a major factor here, and that needs to be considered and balanced. And I think it all really starts, and kind of back to, you mentioned earlier, Pinedale and some of that country in the Red Desert. Some of that, it was old technology. It wasn't during the era of the horizontal drilling we're seeing, or the directional drilling we're seeing now, and they have gotten better, no question. But to me, it's about really identifying these critical habitats. And for example, in the Pinedale area, crucial winter range, those migratory routes that have now been identified with GPS collars that have gained some popularity, and not popularity, but have been really been publicized now greatly. Just identifying these critically important pieces of habitat that connect the pieces together. That's what's really important. And protecting them, but not always necessarily locking them up. Putting them in wilderness or some other, just managing them differently. So the directional drilling gives us an opportunity to do things, but some places are going to need to be protected. Right. So it's really just about developing a better balance to protect wildlife and still have the oil and gas resources, allow sustainable ranching and grazing and all the other development and other uses of not just our public lands, but private lands as well. And we've demonstrated that it can be done.
Right, and that's where I'm reading last night I read some of the stuff you'd given me in advance. The Sage Grouse Initiative talks more about the positives and the solutions and where things have worked. Because right now, just from a pure bloody knuckle political perspective, there's fights going on about sage grouse possibly getting listed as an endangered species under the Endangered Species Act. And as quick as you start interjecting that, a lot of rational thought goes out the window. It's purely emotion driven a lot of times. It's you get a lot of hidden agendas competing when that interjects itself. Before we go into some of these real positive things, and the reason I want to talk about them is I've watched some really cool work being done on sage grouse by private landowners, by ag operators, by other groups that have really made a positive difference, not just for sage grouse, for water quality, for pronghorn, for mule deer, for birds of prey, for a whole host of other species. But before we get to those examples, tell me, where are we at in this? I hear differing things. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who makes the determination of whether a species gets listed, i.e. put on the endangered species list, that they've already got their mind made up. It doesn't matter. By the fall of 2015, we're screwed. And there's some people who play that fiddle and they've got their donation cup out there.
Yeah.
Right? You and I know that.
I know those.
Any crisis creates an opportunity for some of the groups out there.
Yep.
So tell me where we're really at in that process. How far along are we in assessment of this, and when's the decision going to come out?
Sure. Let me give you a little brief history, because I do think there's a lot of misconceptions out there, and some do believe that this is somehow driven by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which they are a major player, and obviously they are the driver of the ESA. But this didn't just happen overnight.
Right.
And, it wasn't the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service biologists necessarily that brought this to the table. This has been going on for decades, and back around 1994 or so, the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, which is
our state agencies, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, Wyoming
Correct.
Game and Fish, blah, blah, blah.
Yep. They pulled together a technical team to evaluate the potential for filing a listing a petition to list the sage grouse on behalf of WAFWA. These are state agency biologists that were very concerned about declining habitat, declining numbers of sage grouse. And at that particular, go ahead.
WAFWA is Western Association of Fish and Wildlife.
Fish and Wildlife Agencies, okay. Yes. And, they determined at that time that the species didn't meet the criteria to list. But biologists in the state agencies and others have been concerned about sage grouse and sagebrush for quite some time. There was a bunch of action, a lot of legal actions and petitions to list. A lot of things kind of happened. But in 2000, WAFWA, if I can use the acronym now, we explained it, Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, they started conservation planning. They pulled together a key group of scientists and biologists and others to put together a conservation strategy. That all started in 2006. 2000.
So we're 15 years past that.
At least
kind
into
of
it.
Huddle, yep. Let's draw the game plan.
Yeah, so they really started considering it. A lot of research, which we know a lot about sage grouse. There's 5 decades at least of sage grouse science. It really picked up after that, at that point. In 2005, after some of the legal action and filing of petitions and such, the Fish and Wildlife Service determined that the sage grouse was not warranted for listing in 2005.
10 years ago.
Yep.
Okay.
The courts, after some legal issues and legal action was taken, the courts decided that, in fact, the Fish and Wildlife Service needed to redo that 2000 not warranted finding. And there were some reasons for that based on some science issues and some other things. Details probably aren't really necessary at this point.
Sure.
At that time, however, they did determine that they had to go back and look at this again.
The court said this. Not the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service says, hey, right now we're okay. But the court said, no, you didn't do a complete analysis, or we disagree with your findings.
Correct.
Okay. Because people always like to get mad at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service when the courts tell them to go do something else.
Correct.
So I just want to...
And we're going to visit this again at some point because we're going to get there again in September. But,
right. And I want people to understand that when the courts say, and you know, there are groups that go around and kind of shop for judicial opinions.
Yep.
When the court says, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, BLM, you're going to do this, it's not like they say, go to hell, Judge.
Yeah.
Go to hell, Ninth Circuit. Go to hell, wherever. They got to do what the court says. So correct. We as citizens need to make that distinction that what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service gets told to do, whether it's by Congress or by the courts, it's not like they make this up out of the blue sky and say, oh, today I'm going to go and research sage grouse more just for the hell of it. I mean, that's right. That's part of their job. But the court, what you said in 2000, after their
2005,
2005,
yep.
The court said, go back and reconsider.
Yep. And reconsider the science and look at new science that's come forward. And in fact, in 2010, they did come up with a warranted but precluded. Now, warranted means they do warrant protection under the Endangered Species Act, but precluded gets a little confusing for folks, but what it means is that they're warranted, but we've got a list of species a mile long, and sage grouse aren't on our top tier. They've got to wait. We've got more urgent species. Their populations are lower. Their threats are greater. There's greater uncertainty, whatever it is. So they were determined warranted but precluded in 2010. Another flurry of legal actions happened, and the court decision was to direct the Fish and Wildlife Service to make their decision by September 30th, 2015. So after that ruling was handed down, they gave them 5 years to go forward and make a decision, and that decision's coming up in about 2 months.
Okay. So one of the things I've noticed since 2005 is our state agencies, not just Fish, Wildlife, and Parks in Montana, not just Wyoming Game and Fish, but a lot of our state agencies are trying to think this through of how do we do better?
Yeah.
And I've seen some pretty cool stuff, some just changes, just cooperative things with landowners or with people holding grazing allotments, with whoever it might be. And in this this book you gave me about the Sage Grouse Initiative. I've read some of these, and there's some remarkable stuff going on that's been in place now for a good amount of time that I think is cool. It's more of the, do you use the switch or do you use the sweet carrot?
Yep.
And I'm looking at how some of these stories are real compelling stories, because these people featured in these, I don't know how many pages this is. It's 30 almost 40 pages.
Yep.
These are people who are connected to the landscape just like hunters are.
They're real ranchers.
And
these are not hobby ranchers or big production farmers. These are real Montanans, real Nevadans, real Wyomingites that are living on the land and managing their lands.
So this, and I'm hoping you'll get us down this path here then of talking about, because you started saying, well, it's easy for everyone to identify problems. And it is. I mean, if it wasn't
human nature,
if it wasn't for problems, there wouldn't be any expose medias. There wouldn't be 20/20 or 60 Minutes. So I'm interested, and I hope we can get to this. I don't mean to keep interrupting you, but I'm interested in where the progress has been made.
Well, I think, and I'll get to the private sector here in just a second, but I want to mention a couple things. Mm-hmm. One of the things that has, in my view, kind of helped us at least get to where we're at now with not only developing the conservation plans, but where I hope we're going to get to the service determining a not warranted decision. We got a little lucky because we've had rain.
Okay, you said, and I want to make this clear for the listener, you said, I hope we get to the not warranted decision.
Correct. That would mean that they are not warranted for protection under the ESA. Management of sage grouse would stay within the hands of the state wildlife agencies. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to go back to business as usual, and we need to come back to that because there's a lot around that to talk about.
And so someone who is spending their career in this sage grouse community issue, your hope is that the evidence shows, the science supports that we have changed the direction, that we are doing the right thing for sage grouse, and hopefully in 2 months they're not on the endangered species list. That's it. If Ed was king for a day, that would be the hope that
the goal is to get to a not warranted.
Okay.
And I think every stakeholder involved with this wants this to get to a not warranted. But that doesn't come without cost and sacrifice.
Right.
But I think the three things that have kind of helped us to potentially get there, we've had good precipitation, mostly range-wide, which has helped, and the numbers are up, quite frankly. And they're a cyclical species, but they have been up recently because we've got good habitat conditions. The second thing, we've had low oil and gas prices. That's not hurt us.
Right.
And the third thing, to the initiation of this part of the conversation, private landowners and the Sage Grouse Initiative and other things that private landowners are doing now. We've already got a leg up and we're moving in the right direction. The private landowners have flexibility. They can do things now, immediately, and they have been doing so. Now, there's a lot of landowners out there that have been doing the right thing, if you will, however you want to quantify that, for a long, long time.
Right.
You've got great examples here in Montana. A classic is over near Wisdom and the Arctic grayling, where landowners got together and really put together a good conservation strategy that yielded a not warranted for the Arctic grayling.
Yep.
That was a main part of that. We've got a lot of those success stories. The Sage Grouse Initiative, since its inception, it's under the Natural Resource Conservation Service. It utilizes existing funding sources and tools to help provide support for landowners to do any number of things. But it involves improving their grazing, helping develop, specifically tailored grazing management plans so they can adjust grazing practices, water management, riparian area protection, marking fences, removing juniper. All kinds of things have happened. Since its inception, they've enrolled almost, a little over 1,100 ranches across 11 states. They've successfully contributed to habitat improvements on about 6,000 square miles, which is twice the size of Yellowstone National Park, basically. Right. They've got conserved in perpetuity 360,000 acres of intact habitat of sagebrush. And, that easement acquisition of sagebrush country has increased 18-fold since the inception of this program. So they are putting things on the ground. And that's all, and $500 million that's already gone into this program, and another committed $250 million this year, in the coming year. So, and that's all great, but what's really cool and what you read in the report, and what I find fascinating, and who the messengers really are, the producers themselves.
Right, the people on the ground.
They see the experience, exactly. And there's an example out near Winnett, the Delaney Ranch. They've documented an 18% increase in their calf weights. They graze fewer cows, but they're gaining more weight. They've increased their bottom line. They're providing good sage grouse habitat, and it's all about the grass. Right. And one of our colleagues that joined a panel discussion that we had yesterday as part of our Western Media Summit said just that. This is about making grass.
Right.
And when you have a good base of grass, good range management, everything else falls into place. Yeah. Including the wildlife and their bottom line.
When did Aldo Leopold come out with Sand County Almanac? Like in the 40s?
Mm-hmm.
So here we are, 70 years later. It all comes back to the land.
And the pieces of the cogs of the wheel.
Yeah.
As he said. And thinking like a mountain.
Yeah. So, anyhow, continue with this, because I think this is a good exercise for those of us who are hunters the Endangered Species Act has become almost a 4-letter word to some people. And we've dealt with it on wolves. We'll deal with it on grizzly bears, where it comes to the topic of sage grouse. It's going to come to a lot of topics in our future. So just going through this is helpful for the listener to understand how this process works and what you've got us to now through your date. Where are we on the calendar? 2010 here? As you're giving us
well, we're past that, and now we're up to the deadline. We're coming up on the decision in a couple of months.
Okay. So the Endangered Species Act becomes the big hammer that some fear.
And there's nothing like a good crisis to motivate people to
That's right.
to make change and do some things a little different.
Yeah, to make change. And then
the hammer.
And then there's nothing like a crisis for some people to come in and act like they're going to save us from ourselves. And much like it was in the wolf issue back in 2011, and everybody who listens to this podcast, watches my TV show, knows that I was very involved in the wolf issue. And it was unfortunate that I saw groups who, I call them the Johnny-come-latelys to the discussion, wanted to come in and start dictating policy on wolves. Even though they'd been here in Montana since 95, been in Wyoming, Idaho, and we'd been working on this process for 15, 16 years. And here comes out-of-state groups with their money, thinking they're going to tell us how we should manage wolves. And I'm referring to a group that tried to say they were representing hunters in the wolf issue. And they screwed us over so bad that if they would have just shut up and went home, we would have a way better outcome, a quicker outcome on wolf delisting. So now I see some of those same groups showing up, acting like they're going to save us from the big bad wolf, i.e. they want to make the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service the big bad wolf. And quite honestly, I don't trust them. And I don't know if you guys run into this a lot in the work you do, because you're a scientist, Ed. You're not a politician, policy guy like I get sucked into.
But I do work in the policy arena now, with the scientific background.
I worry that hunters, whether you're a big game hunter, a whatever hunter, are being sold a bill of goods by some who are trying to capitalize on a crisis. And right now there's a group out of Utah that's been provided millions of dollars from the Utah legislature to go and jump into the fray on sage grouse. And it pisses me off because they had nothing to do with sage grouse. They stuck their head in the sand. This group wasn't even formed by the so much great sage grouse work had been done on the western landscape before this group even formed as an LLC, and now I guess they're supposedly some non-profit group. They started as a for-profit group. And so here they are, they're out there with all this welfare money from the Utah legislature, telling hunters, oh, you got to do this, you got to do that. Oh, it's going to take away your hunting access, blah, blah, blah. Am I in the dark here, or am I seeing an absolute replication of what happened with wolves?
There's definitely some parallels, and there's definitely some misconceptions or misinformation that's being shed on that. And I will say, particularly on the access issue, we've been hearing this for some time now, and it's coming from probably a variety of sources, but no doubt driven by special interest to scare hunters that their access to lands is going to somehow be taken away, and that couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah.
I mean, I've read every resource management plan that's out there now that is going to be amended, or the EISs that are environmental impact statements. Sorry to the listening public
right.
using the acronyms. The environmental impact statements that the Bureau of Land Management is now finalizing to amend all of their resource management plans for sage grouse conservation. Everything in those current plans regarding travel management and access have stayed the same.
Right.
They're going to deal with travel management after the sage grouse amendments are made, and they have to do some assessments and figure out, if it makes sense to close certain roads. But we're not talking about closing access.
Right.
We're talking about closing potentially some vehicular access, probably closing situations of cross-country ATV use and
right.
off-road vehicle use. There can be, and this is something the public may not understand and appreciate either, is the retrieval of game is a really big issue. Well, they can issue special permits for handicapped persons, elderly persons.
Right.
They already have the administrative tools to do this. So you and I may have to walk a little further into our favorite hunting spot at some point, but it's not going to affect a lot of access.
Right.
A lot of places are just going to stay the same the way they are.
Right.
And the other misconception that's really floating around out there from probably this group and others is that the access. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. but the grazing aspects of this too. There's this notion that ranchers aren't going to be able to turn their cattle out during lekking season. That they're not going to be able to ride the range during the spring and move their cattle around during the spring because of lek disturbance. And I can tell you this because I've confirmed it with the Department of Interior and Bureau of Land Management. Hunting and cattle grazing are not considered disruptive activities that fall under travel management restrictions like people are being told. And so it's just a lot of misinformation out there.
So that gets to my point about this. And some people are going to say, Randy, you're dividing the hunting community by saying this. And the listeners I know are sitting there saying, who's he referring to? Who's he referring to? And I'm going to tell you right now who I'm referring to. And Ed, if this puts you in a hard spot, I apologize. But it pisses me off that Big Game Forever, based out of Utah, came in, screwed up the wolf issue the way they did. They went to Congress and issued, in 2011, they sent out an email. And so I'm going to have to give some background so people understand why I've formed my opinion about Big Game Forever the way I have. So we're all in Congress. We're arguing, we're debating, we're trying to get state control of wolves. Big Game Forever and their sister parent, whatever you want to call it, Sportsmen for Fish and Wildlife, based in Utah. Representative Mike Simpson from Idaho comes forth with a bill that says, you know what, we are tired of continual litigation putting wolves back on the shelf and keeping it out of state management. I have this idea. So Congressman Simpson is a Republican. I say we go back and we say that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife delisting ruling that said Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, and it ended up in his bill, ended up just being Idaho and Montana because of the conflict of Wyoming's management plan at the time. So Congressman Simpson from Idaho says, I've got this idea. We're going to make that delisting ruling that was issued the law of the land. We're going to make it not subject to judicial review. And he floats it around. Democratic senator from Montana, John Tester, says, I like that idea too. So now we have a bipartisan, affected constituent piece of legislation called the Simpson-Tester rider that gets attached to a piece of legislation, a congressional budget resolution. And along comes Big Game Forever and Sportsmen for Fish and Wildlife, and they send out their hatchet squads. They are up in arms. This is the end of Western civilization as we know it. And they went so far as to, in Congress, sent an email to all 535 people in Congress, falsely stating that the Boone and Crockett Club, the Safari Club, the NRA, and the Congressional Sportsman Foundation were in their camp and did not support the Simpson-Tester amendment. That shit might work in Utah, but that's a good way to get your ass handed to you in the outside of the beehive state. And so a friend of mine sends me an email that has this. He's like, Randy, this is going to blow up. Thought you might want to know it. And I'm sitting on that, and I'm like, are they really this dumb? Would they go out and send an email misrepresenting the position of 4 of the big dogs in D.C.? Boone and Crockett Club, Safari Club, the NRA, and the Congressional Sportsman. Well, they did. And they got their teeth handed to them, because anyone who doesn't believe this, go to my hunttalk.com website. The press releases are out there, because the next day the NRA sent out a press release completely tearing a new one in the hind ends of Sportsmen for Fish and Wildlife and Big Game Forever. And it closed with something that says, any information provided, any actions taken by Sportsmen for Fish and Wildlife and Big Game Forever should not be trusted, should be verified, blah, 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 blah. So any of you listening who are going to drink the Kool-Aid being served up by these, what would I call them, carnies of crisis, better think long and hard about listening to what Big Game Forever says. Because, and here's the irony. Right now, those guys in Utah, they go around their Utah legislature and they take credit for wolf delisting. The only wolf delisting we have came because a bunch of us in Montana and Idaho and in the Great Lakes state busted our asses and had to fight them behind the scenes, and now they're the ones taking credit for it. So I'm sorry, folks, that's a tangent of Randy Newberg's absolute, I can give you every chapter, verse, fact, email, phone call. You can ask any of the big players who were involved in wolf delisting that if it weren't for Big Game Forever, if it weren't for Sportsmen for Fish and Wildlife, we would have had a way better outcome. We would have had a way easier outcome for wolves than what we have. So the next time one of those guys try to tell you they saved you from the big bad wolf, they were the ones fighting and screaming and yelling. So after they get called out by the NRA, I mean, it's a blistering press release. Everyone involved in hunting and concerned about management should read that press release. It came out in February, I believe, 20th, 24th of 2011. And a few days later, these clowns in Utah say, oh, well, one of our secretaries sent that out inappropriately. Oh, really? The dog ate your homework, huh? You talk about chicken shit. Okay, so I give that as perspective and background to the listener, because here we are 4 years later, and while Big Game Forever is out there taking credit for the wolf delisting they had nothing to do with and that they opposed from the beginning, they are now out here. Utah gave them, I don't know how much money again.
$4 million.
$4 million over the last...
Two in two installments.
Right, over the last few years. And so Big Game Forever is running around telling all the hunters that if the sage grouse this and the sage grouse that, that's going to stop you from having hunting access to all these places. And I've looked and I've looked and I've asked and I asked, and I cannot find one document anywhere that says that any of the sage grouse changes, any of the sage grouse plans are going to stop me from being able to hunt pronghorn in Wyoming or hunt mule deer in Nevada or whatever.
That's absolutely correct.
So I'm sorry to take the microphone, okay. Ed, and I know that you see this, but you're the scientist.
Well, there are some parallels here. There is a campaign on sage grouse right now, and I'll tell you a little bit about what that is. Yeah. And it is definitely coming from those groups. It largely centers on delay, right, and basically trying to hand over the state plans that have been developed by the state agencies and forcing them on our public lands to be used. We can get into that a little bit later, but the thrust of the campaign is to delay the listing decision. And they're trying to move that onto the National Defense Authorization Act.
Right.
There's only two things that are really moving in this dysfunctional Congress right now, and that's budget and defense.
Right.
These are must-pass pieces of legislation. So those are getting littered with a variety of different riders. And our sportsman's contingency, we're successful in helping with many others to defeat that at this point in time, to getting that on the National Defense Authorization Act. It was a 10-year delay, supposedly to allow the state plans time to manifest and work, show that they work. We actually think that if we continue down the path of getting strong BLM plans, strong plans for the Forest Service and BLM lands, our public lands, good state plans, and then complemented by all this extraordinary private lands work, we can get to a not warranted.
Right.
So you don't need a delay.
Exactly.
And if you wait 10 years, the foot may come off the gas. It may, you're going to see, these plans, some of these plans develop and manifest, but there's just no reason to wait 10 years. If I'm a landowner, and here's the part of the bill that a lot of people don't understand, or the language anyway, it keeps that sage grouse in a warranted but precluded status. That's right. What kind of certainty is that? Exactly. If you're a business owner? Let's get to not warranted and move forward.
Move forward.
Exactly.
Right. But there's no money in that. I mean, let's face it, there are some people who know that a crisis is an opportunity to profit.
Exactly.
And nobody has built a franchise model any better than those groups out of Utah. And I don't mean to make this a bash those guys thing, but they stick their nose where it doesn't belong. They don't have any professional qualifications like you do. They're manned by attorneys and other stuff, which, I got a few attorney friends, but I don't admit that when I'm in front of the public. But no.
Lawyers, consultants, and lobbyists are lots to gain in any of these issues.
I see the sage grouse issue getting polluted with the term I was going to use was incorrect information. But
fear-mongering, too.
Exactly. It's more intent of... It's more... the intent of it is more sour than just incorrect information. It's with a purpose that people are doing this, because it's paying them money. And if anyone is listening, I would bet you that if by October 1st we get a ruling from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that you and I both hope for, says not warranted, that group from Utah is going to be out there banging the drum, taking credit for it all, and they just showed up on the scene 2 years ago.
Can you imagine what that $2 to $4 million would have bought in conservation? Easements, juniper clearing, any number of things.
Helping landowners develop better water plans, helping grazers develop better grazing plans. But no, the fear-mongering, and this is, and the reason I'm focusing on this is in the hunting world, I have seen in my life a greater trend of hunters drinking Kool-Aid just because someone says I represent hunters. And it gets to the point of me saying, hey, buddy, think about this. do yourself the favor and spend 5 minutes, 2 minutes looking at this. Don't just take it as the gospel because some guy says it so. And I know some are going to say, Randy, how could you hack on a group like that or groups like that? I didn't ask for this. They came in my state and started effing up something that was very important to me. They asked for it. And I'm not, as long as I have platforms, and it's not just these two groups, it's any group that thinks you're going to come and hijack the hunting world for your own personal interest, for your own agendas. You're not going to do it without me saying something about it. And if people get pissed off about that, that would imply I care. I care that people get pissed off, and I hope they get pissed off not about me saying it, but about the fact that some view hunting as just a tool and a mechanism for their business strategy. I mean, I tell people that some of these groups, even the drive-by litigator groups that I often end up in their crosshairs also, and these other groups that don't like me pointing out that they're hijacking the hunting message, they did not look at wolves as Canis lupus. The wolves were not a canine to them. They were a bovine. They were a cash cow. And so now, here we are. I don't even know what the proper term is for sage grouse. I should. I mean, they're obviously not.
That's probably a cash cow for some sector.
Exactly. So here we are again. And I know I've went on a tangent here, Ed, and I apologize for that. But
that's good context,
I want the audience to understand that there is a lot of really good work being done on sage grouse. And it's being done to help not just sage grouse, but entire sage communities.
Yep.
And it's helping the wild creatures that live in those communities. It's helping the water quality and the fish that live in those communities. And it's helping the locals on the landscapes who are making a living by ranching, farming, whatever.
And there's not a Chicken Little scenario here either. No. And that's part of it as well. And we hear that a lot, and as it relates to the ESA, and change scares people a lot, right. And we have to change. Everybody's going to have to give a little on this particular issue, and change is scary. But the reality is, we're not putting people out of work, we're not putting people out of business, not at the extent that we've heard in some of the fear mongering and the misinformation that I think's out there. And it's testimony right here to some of these ranchers that are working through the SGI program. Oil and gas industry is not going to go belly up because of the sage grouse issue.
No.
It might have some ups and downs because it's a globally traded commodity and there are things going on in other parts of the world.
Right.
That might be something people should consider. But you touched on something I think is a really critical and fundamental statement that every one of your listeners and every person should pay attention to. Knowledge is power.
Right.
And just educate yourself on the issue before you drink the Kool-Aid. And if you read some of the letters that I have read that have been put forward for petition letters from Big Game Forever on the sage grouse issue as it relates to the National Defense Authorization Act, if you actually read the letter, most of it you could say, well, I can get behind that. Mm-hmm. And it's how it's crafted. It's right. Very carefully crafted with absolutely no details. And this is a very, very complex issue. There's a lot of moving parts on the science side. There's a lot of moving parts on the management side. And then you throw the policy into all this. But we have to focus on the biological science.
Right.
The political science is just, it's there. It's always going to be there.
Right. And guys like me are going to engage in it.
Exactly. But so to get to that not warranted, we have to base everything we do on the biological science, and actually getting to that not warranted is going to require some conservation and some better balance. And not everybody wants to hear that.
Right. Oh, exactly. It's, I think about some of these other complications that we as a society have added as priorities to what we value, and how that has come at the expense of sage communities. I'll get in trouble for saying this too. The Wild Horse and Burro Act is the worst piece of legislation that I can think of from a standpoint of our society expressing some priority about what we want to have happen on the landscapes. And I say worst piece, I'm talking in reference to the Great Basin area of Nevada, areas of Utah, Wyoming, Colorado. And some of you guys are listening to this, have horses, are going to think I'm an anti-horse guy. I don't care if you have horses. I grew up in a logging family, so we had skidders and stuff like that, not horses. But in Nevada, where I went to college, and where I've been back hunting probably every other year since then, at the time I was going to college in the 80s, the horses were starting to become a problem. And there's a great piece of ground in northwest Nevada called the Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge. It is one of my favorite places in all of North America.
Yep, mine too.
It has an amazing story. The Last Chance Ranch was the core of that. It was bought by the Boone and Crockett Club in the 1930s. And the purpose of it was to be nothing but a pronghorn refuge or management area.
Yep.
And then they acquired more and more, and they turned it over to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and it's now managed as one of our wildlife refuges. And there are so many horses there. They are destroying the landscape to a point where, if anyone's ever seen how horses interact at a water source compared to how pronghorn or mule deer a sage grouse can't stomp a water source down into just this big flat, looks like a sheet of water.
Well, they're extremely aggressive too, and they'll keep other animals from the water source.
Right.
It's amazing to watch that on
my
film.
son had an archery pronghorn tag in Nevada in 2007, and there was this very small water source, and the horses would just line up there, and they would chase the pronghorn out, and they would chase other horses out, and they would go in and they'd drink that water to the point where they drank it dry, and it would trickle back. They'd come back and drink it dry. And up in the Sheldon, where I had a pronghorn tag, a rifle tag the same year, I knew of some water sources there that at the time when I had went up there chucker hunting and just hanging out, these were deep. They weren't large in diameter, but they were quite deep water sources that would last throughout the summer. I went to those thinking, hey, it's late August, early September. This is going to be a place to shoot a pronghorn. I got there, and the horses had stomped and degraded these water sources to where they weren't now just 20 feet across and 2 feet deep. They were 200 feet across and 2 inches deep and dry. And maybe something else happened, I don't know. But talking to the range biologists there on the Sheldon, they're like, no, these are the impacts horses have. Mm-hmm. And so I look at, and people are going to say, why does this impact sage grouse? Wild horses and burros are a feral species, an invasive species. As much as people love them, my dog, I've got a pet. It's technically an invasive feral species. It might sit on our lap and it's a great pet. But having these on the sage landscapes to the degree we do has to have some impact on sage grouse and other wildlife.
No question. And in my conversations with professional colleagues, particularly in the Great Basin, it's an elephant in the room.
Right. And nobody wants to
nobody really wants to talk about it, but they have to be managed. Not going to get into whether the legislation and its details and those kinds of things, right, wrong, or indifferent, it is. And we have to live with it at this point in time until Congress decides to do something about the wild horse and burro legislation. But the BLM does have some tools that it can use to manage, but they're not lethal methods. And that's the crux of the problem. And, I'm in your camp in terms of them being a feral and invasive species. There's no question. The Wildlife Society, which is the professional society of wildlife biologists, has a position statement that I would encourage your listeners to go read. You can draw it off their website. Just Google up the Wildlife Society and look under position statements, and there's a clear statement from the wildlife community on wild horse and burros.
And
I couldn't tell you exactly what it says, other than the fact that it talks about the fact that they're not considered a species of wildlife, and they have to be managed accordingly. So,
I guess the reason I bring it up, Ed, is not because I want to pick on horses and burros, but when you're talking about a big issue like sage grouse that has such a large landscape footprint, there are so many other things that are affecting it. Yep. And that's why we talked about fire earlier.
Yep.
We talk about wild horses and burros. We probably should talk about Pinyon Juniper encroachment and what that does to the entire plant community around there. You look at, and again, this is places I go to 20 years later that I used to go to that, well, there was a stream with some aspens here at one time.
Now it's all juniper.
And it's dry as a board.
Yeah.
And so we have so many things going on in these sage communities that I think people, like I said at the beginning, you drive through and you think, oh, this all looks the same. But these are extremely complex systems, extremely fragile systems, but yet remarkably robust and able to really do some or provide some remarkable outcomes and remarkable end products or annual products when they are brought back to health.
Yeah. And the juniper thing has been a real success story to the extent that we've really cleared a lot of that in a lot of acres. A lot of examples in Oregon, well, really, quite frankly, across the range, but particularly in the Great Basin area in Utah. We're getting juniper removal in Colorado and other states as well. A lot of that's through the SGI program, the Sage Grouse Initiative, NRCS programs, but a lot of that's happening, under federal management planning. We need more of it. The problem is scale. You just can't clear enough of it. If there was a market for juniper right now and it made lots of money, we'd all of a sudden have juniper preserves probably. Yeah. Or certainly stringent management conditions. But we definitely need to be able to clear more juniper. And it pays off. It demonstrates, you get results quickly in some conditions. Others, it's going to take more time. But that's beneficial for mule deer. That's beneficial for pronghorn. You reestablish forb and grass communities. I mean, imagine a lot of straws out there that look like green trees. That's what a juniper is. It's sucking all the water and nutrient resources away from other plants, shading them out. And they naturally should be there in certain places, but not to the extent that we see now. They're just encroaching. Right. And we need to set that back, and it's going to be good for the system entirely.
Right. It's going to be good for those people trying to make a living. When you say some of these ag producers tell you it's about growing grass.
Yep.
Growing grass is difficult in a Pinyon Juniper complex.
I'm just going to give you a quote because I just happened to have it in front of me at the Sage Grouse initiative. There's lots of great quotes from producers, but here's one right to the point we're talking about. I've been thrilled, just very pleased with the response. It's almost unbelievable how the native species are coming back. This is from rancher Jay Tanner on juniper removal and how it's restored water to his historic springs on his land.
So it's stuff like that, and the reason I'm touching on a lot of tangents is I want people to understand that these sage communities they're like nothing else in North America. They're remarkably beautiful. They're fascinating.
And unique to North America.
And for me, I love pronghorn, I spend so much time in these communities. I love mule deer. I love all that the desolation of the Intermountain West provides. I observe all these things just because I'm a hunter. And so when I follow the arguments in the process that is happening with sage grouse, I follow it with great interest because, we'll get to probably one of the last points here. Even though I'm not a sage grouse hunter by trade or by passion, I am a lot of other things that these communities, these sage communities provide that are they are so important to me and so important to a lot of people
And not just sportsmen.
Right.
The outdoor recreation economy, let's come back to that. There have been studies that singled out the sage ecosystems, and they provide recreational opportunities, hiking, biking, camping, and you can start adding those dollars up into the billions real quick.
Fast. So I'm going to, some of these viewers are going to be like I was about 5 years ago, because I shot some sage grouse in the early 2000s. Took some friends out. They shot sage grouse, and I just kind of helped with the dogs. And I was under the premise that hunting sage grouse was a major contributor to these declines. And then I saw the research. Someone published it. And I found out I was wrong. Is that correct, that hunting is not a significant
No, it's not
considered.
considered. It's not considered a major threat. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does not consider this a major threat. The state agencies do not consider this a major threat. No scientific studies indicate that this is a major threat to the bird hunting. Yeah. I will say, however, that the sage grouse are a little different than quail and pheasants and other game birds in that they do have higher overwinter survival. They're a little bit longer lived than some of the other game species, so we have to be managed a little differently. Mm-hmm. And the states have taken responsibility and done that. Hunters have contributed, and I'll give you some statistics from the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, who need to update this data, and they're working on this. But from 2000 to 2012, it was estimated that sportsmen's dollars contributed about $132 million into sagebrush ecosystem conservation, sage grouse research, all of the things surrounding this. That's coming not just from license sales, because if you tallied up the sage grouse license sales, you probably couldn't you couldn't buy a whole lot of easement or clear a lot of juniper. But when you start talking about dedicated Pittman-Robertson Act dollars, which come off the sale of firearms and such, those are decisions that the states have made to say, we want to conserve these systems, we want to research these systems. So they and coupled with license sales and habitat stamps and all that stuff, that's generated in that time period $132+ million. It's more than that now, obviously. Right. So sportsmen have provided funding sources and contributed to the solution. They've also determined that I totally lost my train of thought here again.
Every time Ed loses his train of thought, here's what's happening. In this production room, Randy sits down and writes notes while he's talking, because I got another question I want to ask him and another point I want to make. So it happens often where I'm over there scribing, and the guest is looking at me like, is he giving me demerits here, or what's the deal? So,
but I did pick it up. So, but sportsmen have contributed these dollars, but they've also sacrificed. So this was kind of my point, is that, and we're not complaining about that. I don't know too many sportsmen complaining about lost opportunity.
Shortened seasons.
But when I hear special interest groups and industry and others say that hunting is the driver of this, hunting is the main problem, we need to stop hunting them right now. It's never been demonstrated that it's a source problem. We've been contributing, and oh, by the way, we have sacrificed. Oregon manages their hunting, and they have for a long time, on a permit system.
As does Nevada.
Yep. Wyoming has reduced their harvest season and bag limits down. Montana just did reduce their bags, their season last year, and closed certain areas. So the states are managing as they should and accordingly.
Right. And that gets me to the point of just this dirty thing of politics again. And in Montana, the last two legislative sessions, we've had the same legislator come forward with a bill to close sage grouse hunting in Montana under the premise of establishing some supposed fact pattern that you hunters are why the sage grouse are going downhill. But yet he's affiliated heavily, takes donations heavily from other industries that are contributing a hell of a lot towards the struggles sage grouse and sage communities face. And so that's why I wanted to bring that up. Because
sportsmen, go ahead.
Because hunters are not the problem.
Right.
with sage grouse. If anything, like you mentioned, 132 million whenever that report was done quite a while back. Yeah. And much more since then. And the other part is, if you... sage grouse hunting is like a lot of things. There are some fanatic sage grouse hunters. Mm-hmm. I know some guys who just live for that 2 weekends a year when they go out, and they might only shoot one bird, but it's mostly about working the dogs and going to these places and
the
doing
connections, the experience, right. The camaraderie.
They've done it since Grandpa was here. Blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And as quick as you start closing hunting seasons, you are going to cut off the connection of the greatest advocate that sage grouse have. The Ed Arnetts of the world are hunters at their core. The Randy Newbergs of the world, most of our listeners are hunters at their core.
Yep.
And if we get disconnected and cut off from the interest of sage grouse and sage communities and pronghorn and mule deer, those landscapes lose. And so do the native wildlife that depend on them.
Absolutely. And I will say this regarding the Montana closures. I was very proud of both the local groups in Montana, but also the national groups. We had over 30 groups sign a letter, including the National Rifle Association, Mule Deer Foundation, our organization, and a number of others that sent a letter to the Montana legislature standing up and telling them the facts.
Right.
And the local group stood up too.
And hopefully the readers understand those kind of things for what it is. It's politicians taking our issue and wanting to deflect the blame to the places that they think should be deflected to. And it's very unfortunate. And we as hunters, we hate this politics stuff. We long for the day when our opportunities, our decisions, our landscapes were managed by professionals such as yourself, Ed, rather than the politicians who. But it's not unique in history to see an institution get built that's very valuable. And the institution I'm referring to is our institution of how we manage and how we've brought wildlife to abundance in this country. And now it has this great value. And when you have something of great value, there are other institutions, however insidious, will pop up to try and figure out ways to
tear it down.
Right, tear it down or make it their own.
Yep.
So it's, I guess I shouldn't be surprised. It's just a fact pattern of American history.
History is replete with those examples.
Yeah.
But to the point of sportsmen and politics and policy, those voices matter.
Huge.
This was a small example of a closure of sage grouse hunting in Montana where sportsmen stood up and said, not only no, hell no,
right, and
based it on science and the facts. But we can do this for anything.
Right.
There's 35 to 40 million hunters in the U.S. and Canada. And if we collectively have a voice on these things that matter, we can make a difference.
Yeah.
And you start throwing in things that matter to politicians like jobs, economics. We've got the numbers.
Right.
And we're getting better at those numbers. But it's got to resonate. And everybody listening here, everybody watching all the shows, everybody that goes to the field and doesn't do any of this needs to have that voice heard. Yeah. And we can make a difference.
Well, we've been at this for a while, and we haven't solved all the sage grouse problems of the world. In fact, I've still got a lot more on my sheet here. But Ed, I appreciate you taking the time to come and share your background, your perspective. You've been there, done that, seen it. Anyone with as many degrees as you have in wildlife, probably by accident.
Just means I didn't want to get a real job and finally had to, I suppose.
So
I appreciate the opportunity.
We always close every episode with giving the guest hunter an opportunity to, or the guest hunter. That's when we're doing TV. Podcast, we're not hunting, but gives our guest an opportunity to maybe leave the listeners with a point or two that you really want them to take from this.
Well, I think the way we started this off, why this matters.
Yeah. This
isn't just about sage grouse. This is about a unique ecosystem, which you described very eloquently and very passionately. And I think, this isn't just the possibility of sage grouse and sagebrush. This can happen to any ecosystem or any group of species, and I think, that's a takeaway. Mm-hmm. Whether you hunt sage grouse or not, this is why it matters.
Right.
It's a much bigger picture perspective. I think the other thing is that, for the first time, probably since the ESA was envisioned by its original creators, we've got an opportunity to really take advantage of this crisis and make it that opportunity, but actually, implement the Endangered Species Act as it was visioned. And what it really says is that, and I'm paraphrasing obviously, right, but in a nutshell, it says that we want to keep species from being listed by conserving ecosystems. There's an opportunity here, and we're really close.
Right.
We are really, really close. And it's going to better balance all the multiple uses on our public lands. It's not going to put ranchers
right,
take them off the land. It's not going to restrict sportsmen. It's going to provide a better ecosystem that will provide all of those benefits and services to every American. And I think that's a real key message that everyone can take to the bank, quite frankly, and take to their families and share with others and their friends. We've got an opportunity, and we're really close to the finish line. I will say this also, once we hopefully get to that not warranted decision in September, that's when the race really begins. Mm-hmm. Metaphorically, I've heard people say that we've been running a marathon, and that's true, but actually I think we've been training for the marathon. A colleague in Utah, in fact, made this comment at a recent meeting I was at, that we've been training for the marathon. On October 1st, when we get this decision, and hopefully it's not warranted, now we're going to start running the race because we've got to implement. We absolutely have to implement these plans. We have to have strong funding. We have to have some change in culture,
right,
in the agencies as well as other places. We've got to have strong leadership and make sure that we actually put the conservation practices and management measures on the ground. Because right now, we've got nothing but paper habitat and paper birds and a bunch of planning documents. It has to develop and manifest on the lands and have real habitat and real birds. So we're just getting started.
Yeah.
But we're close. We're going to get there, and it's going to be good for everyone.
Great. Well, as I see what's going on with sage grouse in sage communities, it's uplifting to me. It's exciting. It's all positives from the standpoint of just what you said: ideas, collaboration, setting the target higher. Let's do better. If we pull this off with sage communities and sage grouse don't get listed, which I would bet sage grouse don't get listed. That's just my gut. I'm not a professional like you, so this is just Randy's gut feeling that, they're not going to get listed. And if they don't get listed, I think we take a second and we pat ourselves on the back for the good work that everybody has done. It's not to the credit of one single group, one single stakeholder. It's to the credit of everybody out there on the landscape committing to doing better. And if we can do that and we carry out these plans like you're talking about and get them implemented, and 30 years from now we look back and say, you know what, we brought the sage communities back from...
We did that.
Yeah. That is going to be such a remarkable turnaround that it's going to serve as an example for a lot of other places of conflict, a lot of other places of landscape health and large landscape discussions. And so I'm excited about it. And I hope that come October 1st, I'm not crying in my beer. I don't think I will be.
Toasting rather than crying.
Right. So anyhow, folks, appreciate you listening. Ed, you got any website place that you want to plug here to let people know more about sage grouse or more about what you do? Or
there's lots of resources out there, and back to our knowledge is power. Lots of places you can get information. The Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership website is trcp.org. The Sage Grouse Initiative can be found on the Natural Resource Conservation Services website. And then all the state agencies have a page on sage grouse.
Yep.
And Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, I think, is probably one of the better places to go to get a coalescence of information on what the state agencies are doing. But I strongly encourage the listeners and everyone really to just educate themselves on this and
And be an advocate for the landscape.
Exactly.
Being an advocate for the landscape makes you an advocate for the wildlife that lives there. Well, folks, if you want more about this, when this gets this and all of our podcasts, you can find everything related to us, the Fresh Tracks TV show, the podcast, the Hunt Talk forum, the downloads of our episodes. You can find it all at randynewberg.com. And if you want to see some really in-depth discussions, go to the hunttalk.com web forum. It's the internet home for the public land hunter. We got a lot of really smart people there, not me. I'm not referring to myself. But we got a lot of biologists, a lot of trained professionals that hang out there and kind of keep the discussion honest. There's a pretty serious BS filter out on Hunt Talk. You don't think you're going to throw it on the wall and it's going to stick, because there's some smart guys out there. But it's great discussion that goes on there. So appreciate you guys tuning in. We're leaving and going to tune off here from Bozeman, Montana. Randy Newberg was a little bit unfiltered today, and hope you tune in again for the next one.